All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back for section 14 of this investigations class. And this section, we're going to talk about drugs and organized crime, which might not at first glance seem like related topics, but I assure you they are. Now, let's get started with our funny internet picture of the day. I highly encourage everybody to do this with whatever famous large schools are around because it's just fun. It works also for MIT and Yale and all those big name schools. Super fun. Now, drugs prior to 1914 were essentially just legal for whoever wanted to take them in the United States. Cocaine, marijuana, heroin, morphine, all these things were available very cheap, over the counter, no problem. There's a reason that Coca-Cola begins with the word Coke-a-Cola. One of their main ingredients was cocaine when the formula first started. So it wasn't until 1914 that the United States government said, you know what, we should probably not allow people to just buy and use as much of these narcotic substances as they want. So they banned and outlawed and regulated a heck of a lot of different drugs with that law. The anti-drug legislation was vastly expanded in 1970 with the Controlled Substances Act. And this is the one that really is the main basis for the anti-drug laws of today. So currently, there are 5 schedules or categories or rankings of drugs, and that involves their kind of addictive properties, deadliness. There's a bunch of different aspects of each drug that will kind of dictate which schedule it falls into. The ones with the highest risk of addiction and death and the least amount of medical use is Schedule 1. And then the ones with the least amount of addiction and abuse possibility and the most medical use are down at Schedule 5. Okay? So things like heroin are up at Schedule 1, right? So those are the ones regulated the highest, most focused on, most kind of, it's what the US government says is kind of the worst of the drugs. Down at Schedule 5, you have things like, aspirin. Surprisingly, as of the time of this recording, marijuana is still a Schedule 1 drug, which means the federal government thinks it's among the worst of the worst. It's up there with heroin and methamphetamines and stuff. Another way to classify drugs is not by kind of their seriousness, but by how they affect the body. There's depressants, stimulants, narcotics, hallucinogens, and anabolic steroids. These are the ones, every illegal drug in the United States fits into at least one of these categories. Depressants are ones that tend to make the body's natural processes slow down. Stimulants are ones that make the body's natural processes tend to go faster or more or increased level. Narcotics are, the vast majority of narcotics are the opiates, heroin, opium, things like that, painkillers. Hallucinogens make you hallucinate, see and hear things that aren't there. And then, of course, there's the anabolic steroids that people use for assorted, sporting and other uses. Now, to get specific, one of the major kind of drugs, one of the most popular for at least the last few hundred years, is cocaine. Cocaine is made from the coca plant, which grows naturally in Central and South America. The coca plant has been used for thousands of years by native peoples. They would usually just chew on the leaves, as I understand. But sometime in the 19th or 20th century, somewhere in there, somebody figured out that you can process the chemical from those leaves and create a powder, and then that powder, if snorted, it gives a really way more intense high than just chewing on the leaves does. And then late in the 20th century, they figured out that if you mix the cocaine with things like baking soda and water and then bake it in a pan, it forms this hard, almost like tough cookie-like layered substance that you can then break and crack into lots of little pieces. And then if you smoke those little pieces, you got an even more intense high than snorting the powder cocaine. And that became known as crack because you would crack that, big cookie looking thing into lots of little pieces. Heroin is probably the most famous and probably the most dangerous of all the opiates. And opiates is just a generic term for all the different drugs obtainable from the plant opium. And just opium itself is one of the older and more storied kinds of opiates. There was a big panic, moral panic in the 19th century about how all the Asian immigrants were just smoking opium all day in these horrible opium dens, and they were dangerous and blah, blah, blah. But opium has been used, again, for a long time from the native peoples in kind of the Middle East, Eastern Europe, that kind of area. To this day, the largest grower of opium is Afghanistan. And the problem is, opium and the drugs derived from it are the only real true painkillers that we have to this day. So all the really big, major, high-level painkillers that you can think of that are legal, although under prescription, like morphine, Vicodin, Percocet, all those things, those are all opiates, right? And they are regulated and available via prescription, but opium itself, heroin, some of the other derivatives of opium are illegal, like heroin. Marijuana is by far the most common illegal drug used around the world. They call it weed because it comes from a weed. Like the marijuana plant is, grows anywhere. It's very, very easy to grow. And if you smoke the buds, you get anywhere from a mild to an intense high. Interestingly, it's classified in like 4 different categories depending on who you ask. Some say it's a hallucinogen, some say it's a stimulant. That's just all over the place. And marijuana was focused on hugely as a drug. The anti-drug crusade was focused on marijuana a lot, all throughout the 20th century. And then just in the 21st century, here in the United States and even around the world, they've kind of cooled down on the seriousness of marijuana. For instance, recreational marijuana is now legal in half a dozen or a dozen U.S. states. Medical marijuana is available in even more. There are many countries, especially in Western Europe and that kind of area, where they've completely legalized marijuana at this point. It's not seen as the major intense demon drug that it used to be seen as recently as 20, 30, 40 years ago. And again, most commonly it's smoked, but there are also ways to turn it into an edible or vape kind of a drug delivery system. Methamphetamine is a relatively recent addition to the illegal drug universe. It's an extremely powerful stimulant that can be relatively easily made using kind of household chemicals, which is why methamphetamine drug labs are such a big issue, especially in the more rural parts of the United States. But methamphetamine can be smoked, can be injected, can be snorted. Most commonly, it's found in the rural areas of the country, and it can do a huge amount of damage. But there are people who can take methamphetamines and stay awake for days, a week at a time, just kind of staying high. It was used in World War II by lots of different armies around the world, gave to soldiers so they could kind of fight longer. They didn't have to sleep, they didn't have to rest, they just kept going because they were high on meth. Ecstasy, or MDMA, is just a kind of the classic party drug. It just provides a really intense feeling of euphoria. Rohypnol and GHB and ketamine are all well, especially Rohypnol and GHB, are commonly used as date rape drugs. So they're, if somebody ingests it, they're mostly odorless, mostly colorless, mostly tasteless. Um, and if somebody gets a decent dose, they'll just pass right out and will not wake up. So they're commonly used by bad actors to commit date rapes. Ketamine is also a tranquilizer. It's mostly for use in veterinary situations. Um, Interestingly, it is now being investigated as an antidepressant medication. I actually know someone who is doing ketamine therapy to help with her depression and addictions. Um, but it's done kind of under the special supervision of psychologists and psychiatrists. And the way she describes the situation to me is like, uh, what'd she say? It's like a month worth of therapy in an hour through a fire hose. But it's fairly intense, and it used at obviously much lower doses than a party drug user would want to use. LSD, also called acid, is just a very powerful hallucinogen. In its pure form, it's a liquid, but it is often dripped into paper. And then people will put that paper onto their tongue and let the liquid kind of dissolve out of the paper onto their tongue and then thus enter their system and have really heavy duty, powerful hallucinations. And then, of course, there's just prescription drugs. And there's lots of different prescription drugs that can be abused. Everything from the previously mentioned opiates like Percocet and Vicodin to things like Adderall and Ritalin. All those different prescription drugs can be abused by people taking them in the wrong way or taking too much or just taking them for fun or whatever. One of the most powerful tools that modern law enforcement has to try to combat the drug issue are things called pill identifiers. This is just an app that can go on your phone or a laptop or whatever. And each pill sold in the United States has to be unique. So there's lots of different pill shapes, and then there's markings you can put on the pills and the color of the pill and all those things. The combination of all those identifying characteristics has to be unique to each drug. So, if I take a certain prescription medication and it's, round, flat, green, and has a line through the middle, that's going to be a unique to that drug. But as such, if we find pills on someone and we suspect they're illegal, but the person says, oh no, that's just my blood pressure medication or whatever, we can use those pill identifiers and say, oh, well, it's round and green and has a line through it, and it looks like this and looks like this. And that pill identifier will say, oh yeah, that is exactly this kind of drug. Because each pill has to be unique like that, those pill identifiers are extremely useful. There are also field test kits. These are just, they usually take the form of a little plastic container about that big with a little, what looks like a pill in it, a little glass vial of some chemical. And if police find some white powder and they suspect it might be cocaine, they take a teeny tiny amount of it, you only need a few grains, put it in the little plastic baggie, seal up the top, break the little glass ampule, mix the chemicals with the suspected cocaine, and if it is cocaine, it will turn a bright color, sometimes purple, sometimes blue, depending on the drug and the drug testing kit company or whatever. But that is a positive field identification to establish that that powder you found on whoever either is or isn't cocaine or meth or heroin or whatever drug you happen to think it is. But keep in mind, you cannot use the results of one of these test kits to establish probable cause. You have to have probable cause that this is illegal contraband, or you have to have seized it legally prior to establishing that it is an illegal drug. This can only confirm that it's an illegal drug. It can't give you the probable cause to search or arrest or whatever by itself, right? Sobriety tests. Sobriety tests for alcohol are fairly well established. There are lots of really definitive ways that alcohol affects the body that's relatively easy to do a sobriety test for. Sobriety tests for other drugs are a lot more difficult. sobriety tests for marijuana or heroin or whatever are not nearly at the level of scientific rigor and uh, uh, established history and scientific basis as the sobriety tests for alcohol are, but they do exist. The other thing you got to look out for is paraphernalia. Paraphernalia is just a fancy way of saying all the extra stuff you need to do drugs. So, like a small scale for measuring out certain amounts of drugs can be paraphernalia. Pipes used to smoke any of the smokable drugs can be paraphernalia. Needles for injecting drugs can be paraphernalia. Um, but each different drug has different kinds of stuff you need to go along with it to actually ingest that drug, whether it's shooting it up through a needle or smoking it or whatever. You need different paraphernalia to do that job. Now, physical symptoms of each drug are different. Okay, some drugs make you just want to lay there and not move at all, like heroin. Some drugs make you have huge amounts of energy, like methamphetamine and cocaine. Some drugs make you act like you're seeing things that aren't there because you're seeing things that aren't there. So police need to be really aware of the physical symptoms involved with each of these different drugs. So if they come across somebody acting strange, they can be like, oh, this person's probably on LSD or whatever. One of the big issues, one of the big fears of law enforcement is this situation called excited delirium, which is just kind of a catch-all term for this person is acting really, really weird, and we can't tell you why, but it's almost definitely some kind of drug. But this is over and above a normal physical reaction to drugs. But it's, seemingly huge amounts of strength. The body runs very hot, so they get very sweaty and heated. Very erratic behavior, lots of fear, lots of desire to kind of escape away from what either real or perceived danger, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, this excited delirium is often associated with an overdose. And an overdose is just a generic term for taking too much to the point where it threatens your life. Some drugs are impossible or effectively impossible to overdose on, like marijuana. I don't believe there's ever been a single recorded overdose death for marijuana. But other drugs are relatively easy to overdose on, like heroin. And in fact, the overdose from opioids has become such a big issue that police are now carrying around an anti-overdose medication called Narcan. And Narcan, it can be injected, but in its most common form, I believe it's like a nose spray. So if police come across somebody and they suspect that person is having an overdose of an opiate, they can just spray this Narcan drug into the person's nose. And that drug effectively goes to all of the opiate sensors in their brain and closes them off. So the opiate, whether it's heroin or Vicodin or whatever they've taken, can't then link up in their brain. They can't, it's still in their body, but it can't affect their body the way the drug is kind of supposed to. And thus they become sober like that. My wife is a nurse, and she's told me that at the ER when they administer Narcan, after you administer it, the first thing you do is you stand back because they're, within 2 seconds they're going to come up and they're going to be mean and angry and come up swinging, because it really does just pull them out of an overdose and makes them go from overdosing on this drug to perfectly sober in the blink of an eye. It's an incredibly powerful tool used by paramedics and doctors and police officers and all those people. And it has helped prevent a heck of a lot of overdose deaths. Now, how do we investigate, prosecute, how do we get at these drug manufacturers, sellers, users, etc.? Well, the first thing you can do is controlled buys, right? So we want either an undercover police officer or a confidential informant or somebody to go in and buy drugs from a suspected drug buyer and record it. And we want to get at least 2 of these controlled buys before we go in and arrest any given drug dealer, just to establish that it wasn't entrapment, it wasn't a one-time thing. This is a pattern of behavior. There are also stings where the undercover police pretend to be the drug sellers and wait for people to come by and try to buy the drugs. And again, in order to avoid entrapment in those situations, you have to let the buyer kind of initiate the buy. You can't just say, "Hello, I'm a drug dealer. Would you like to buy drugs?" You kind of have to say, "Yeah, I'm holding what you want." That kind of thing. Use the slang and lingo and kind of hint at the fact that you might be selling drugs and make it kind of obvious that you're selling drugs without saying, "Hi, would you like to buy drugs?" You need to let the buyer kind of establish the idea that they want to exchange money for drugs, so that it's very clear that it was the other person's idea to commit that crime and they weren't persuaded to do it by the undercover police officer. One of the big things that's kind of changed drug buying and selling in the 21st century is online drugstores, right? We no longer have to drive out to a sketchy neighborhood and pull up to somebody who we may or may not know in order to buy drugs from them using cash. We can all just go online and order drugs, paying either in just US dollars with a credit card or Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency, have them delivered right to our house. This is incredibly common, surprisingly easy, especially if you know how to use encryption and the dark web and all those things. But yeah, drug sales are becoming less and less of a street issue and more of a mail delivery service. And of course, drug manufacturing, right? So there's everything from marijuana grow houses, where people just have lots of really powerful ultraviolet lights in a room in their house or their basement or something. These are usually, you can establish evidence for these kind of things by getting a warrant for their electricity bills. And if they're using 4 times the electricity of their neighbor, that's a decent sign that they're running a marijuana grow operation. Other things like methamphetamine labs, these can be really, really, really dangerous because those common household chemicals that you can make meth out of, a lot of them are incredibly explosive. So you have to be really careful when investigating methamphetamine labs to make sure that you don't, blow yourself up, essentially, or you don't spill these really hazardous, nasty chemicals all over the place. Can do a lot of damage both to property and people. Now, organized crime. Organized crime is just a group of people with a hierarchy that commit in some kind of organized way some profit-making crimes, right? So similar to kind of terrorist groups, but organized crime are profit-driven, whereas terrorist groups are ideologically driven, right? So there is a difference there. They both obviously have their crime issues, but organized crime, one of their major sources of income is drug sales. Organized crime loves to buy and sell drugs, especially street gangs, because street gangs are a subset of organized crime. But they often they'll either have like their exclusive or at the bare minimum main money-making venture is drug sales. They have wars and with other gangs over territory in which to sell drugs. But more traditional organized crimes syndicates either don't do drug sales at all, or it makes up a much smaller percentage of their total business footprint, I guess you could say. Some of the more classic ones are gambling. Organized crime has run gambling for a long time. And it's everything from bookmaking, like on, betting on sports games, whether it's, NFL football or college basketball or whatever. You can always call up a bookie to make a bet on a certain kind of sporting adventure. Or there's just kind of organized crime run lotteries where essentially you can put a bet on any three number combination, and then the winner is the person where the Dow Jones, they'll take the last three digits of the Dow Jones Industrial Average for the next day, which is essentially a random three-digit number, and that's the number that'll win. So it's kind of an impromptu kind of lottery kind of situation. Organized crime is also very much into the pornography and prostitution industries. Sex sells. So they'll, run prostitution rings, create and sell pornography, especially in the places where it's either illegal or just, less than legal. Lots of fraud. They'll, get a business, sell off all the legitimate equipment for that business, then file insurance claims saying it was stolen, right? So that kind of insurance fraud, that kind of thing is real common. Loan sharking is kind of exactly what it sounds like. They go to desperate people who need money, give them a loan, but then charge exorbitant interest to the point where that person usually never pays it off. And then the loan shark has to seize something of theirs that's worth way more than the loan was. So they make money. They make a lot of money with the loan sharking business. Money laundering is just taking illegally obtained money and making it appear legal and legitimate so that they can kind of use it in the normal United States monetary system and banking system without worrying that they're going to have it used to against them in court. And obviously, a lot of the times it's their money that they're laundering, but they also do money laundering for others as well, as a contracted service. Human trafficking, this is oftentimes tied in with the prostitution rings. They'll import people from the poorer areas of the world, Central and South America, or Africa, or parts of Asia, import them into the United States or Western Europe or somewhere else, and have them pay off their debt for getting them out of that the place they didn't want to be anymore by engaging in prostitution. Or they can hire them out to farms and factories and other places that are having trouble finding workers. But human trafficking can make a lot of money for organized crime. Protection rackets. This is a classic one seen in a lot of the old school mafia movies where, the mafia person goes into a business, a bakery or a deli or a bowling alley, whatever, and say, hey, there's been a lot of crime around here. My group can protect you from all that crime if you only pay us, $1,000 a month or however much. And if the person pays, great. But if they don't pay, they send in their own guys to commit crimes at that location and then say, oh, hey, heard you had a crime here. You sure you don't want to pay us for protection? And essentially they keep victimizing that person until they agree to pay this protection money every week or every month or however much. And then, of course, there's a little bit of legitimate business, which is often involved in the money laundering process. Organized crime owns tons and tons and tons of legitimate businesses, either for money laundering or for things like insurance fraud, or for lots of other reasons. They want to own some legitimate, totally above board legal businesses, whether it's to make committing crimes easier or just to make it kind of more believable that they would have all this money, that they don't, that they need kind of a visible means of support as well as the illegal means of support. Now, who are the big organized crime groups? Of course, the classic one here in the United States is the Italian Mafia, which isn't actually Italian, so to speak. They were very, very specifically Sicilian, which is if you think of the boot of Italy, there's an island right at the tip of the boot, looks like it's, a soccer ball that the boot of Italy is kicking. That island is Sicily. And the classic, the mafia that everybody thinks of when they think of, movies and TV and organized crime in the kind of the early part of the 20th century, they were specifically Sicilian. and created that, the oh gosh, what was it? Al Capone, Bugs Moran, all those guys. Those was all the Sicilian mafia, and they're still around. They're not nearly as powerful as they were during the days of Prohibition, but they still make a lot of money. They still have a lot of organized criminal enterprises. The old school families still exist. In Asia, there are obviously lots of organized crime groups. In China, kind of the classic, their version of the Italian mafia is called the Triads. I believe that's because there were originally 3 families that came together to form the original group, and then thus they were called the Triad. But I could be wrong on that. Don't quote me. In Japan, it's called the Yakuza. It's a very, very old organized crime group, very distinguishable by their tattoos. They have like full body tattoos, like usually nothing from the neck up, and nothing or minimum on the hands. But other than that, their entire body is usually covered in tattoos. Central and South America has a lot of organized crime groups, kind of the most major of which are the drug cartels, which are especially big in areas like Colombia. These are the people that grow and manufacture drugs and then sometimes try to smuggle it into other countries like the United States or Western Europe or Canada or Australia or wherever by themselves, or sell it to people who want to try to smuggle it into those kind of consumer drug countries. And they do a lot of violence, create a lot of damage. I actually grew up in Texas, and down in those border areas, you'd hear of really brutal crimes committed by the cartels to protect their drug business. In Africa, there are a lot of organized crime groups, the most famous of which is probably from Nigeria. And in Nigeria, those organized crime groups, they're kind of famous for committing the 419 scam, which is the classic Nigerian prince. Hey, I've got $100 million that I'm trying to get outside of my country, but I need your help to do it. And if you help me, I'll give you 10%. Just send me your bank details and I'll wire the money, and then you can, blah, blah, blah. And it was very easy. But I really need to get out of Nigeria because I'm afraid for my life. And those are called 419 scams because in Nigeria, they're a violation of their criminal code under Section 419. And they might have started in Nigeria with the Nigerian prince, but after 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, it was some Iraqi rich person that needed to get money out of Iraq. And then after the invasion of Ukraine, I started seeing some Ukrainian millionaires who need to get money out of the Ukraine, but they always need your help. And to do that, they need your banking details, and they need I need to pay a bribe. Can you send me $5,000? I'll bribe this guy, then you'll get your money. And he's like, oh, $5,000 in exchange for 10 million? Sure, absolutely. But then it's, I need plane tickets, and I need this, and they never actually send the money while constantly asking for more and more and more from you until finally either you go broke or you figure out that it's a scam. Eastern Europe has a lot of organized crime groups. These groups are especially prevalent in things like cyber crimes, in things like human trafficking, and just, all the things we talked about on the last slide. But basically every part of the world has some kind of major organized crime groups, and these are just the big ones. This is not anywhere near a complete list of all the major organized crime groups. Because think about it, even street gangs like the Bloods and the Crips, famously in the United States, those groups are classified as organized crime. Old school motorcycle gangs are organized crime. Every place around the world has some kind of organized crime, whether it's locally grown or imported from other countries. But they commit a huge amount of crime and are raking in zillions of dollars in profits around the world every year. So this is a major, major issue. Investigators really need to be kind of focused on and able to identify who these groups are, what groups are operating in their area, how to identify whether someone's a member of the group or not, what kind of specific crimes they're engaged in, all those kind of things. Anyway, thank you very much. I will see you in the next section.